Good afternoon. I'm Dan Tupper, Commissioner for District 3 and the Vice President of the Board. I'll be facilitating the meeting today. It is a special meeting of the Jefferson PUD Board of Commissioners, Tuesday, February 4th, 2 p.m. JPUD offers both virtual and online meetings as well as in-person meetings unless advance notice is otherwise provided. Online participant audio will be muted upon entry. Please unmute at the appropriate time to speak. If you're calling in, use *6 to mute and unmute and *9 to raise a hand to request to speak. So I'm going to call this to order and we'll start with taking a roll call. Gentlemen?
I'll go. Go ahead, Ken.
Kenneth Collins, Commissioner, District 2.
And Jeff Randall, Commissioner for District 1.
As I stated, Dan Tupper for Commissioner District 3. We have a full board today. Thank you. Next item up is the agenda review. We have two items today, an FCS electric rate update and an executive session. Are there any additions or corrections to the agenda?
No.
Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to adopt the agenda as presented.
So moved.
Second the motion to accept the agenda.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Unanimous. We have an agenda. That takes us on to item 4, which is the FCS electric rate update. I can see some gentlemen from FCS are on. Welcome. I believe the general manager is going to do some introductions here. So go ahead, Kevin.
So we've dealt with Paul and Sergey for our last rate study. They've helped us throughout the years on multiple projects. So we would like to thank them for being here. They're working on the electric rates, need some information from the board. So Paul, Sergey, we appreciate everything you're doing. So take over. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kevin, and thanks for having me this afternoon. I will share my screen here.
Paul, just a point of order as we move forward, you guys want to take questions as we go by point, or do you want us to wait to a certain break in your presentation? How do you guys want us to approach that?
Yeah, you're free to interrupt me and ask questions as we go.
Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, again, thanks for having me today. Sergey Tarasov was originally scheduled to walk through these slides with you this afternoon. Unfortunately, he has come down with the flu. He is on the call, but I will be walking you through the slide deck this afternoon and answering any questions that you may have on some of the numbers I'm going to be sharing with you. So what we are doing today is we're bringing back the discussion on the electric rate study. We did discuss this back in November, some preliminary findings. So we're going to go through a quick background. We're going to spend probably most of the discussion looking at some of the updated numbers and scenarios that we've prepared for you today. But then really want to make sure we're answering your questions. We want to talk about the next steps, and really what we're here today for is to get some direction from you on the overall system increases that we want to at least start planning for. That will allow us to continue down this rate study path and move forward with the cost of service and rate design steps. We don't necessarily need an answer, what scenario you like, but a good direction in terms of this is kind of what I'm liking right now. Why don't we move forward and kind of explore this a little further? So in terms of a background, we did do the last comprehensive update back in 2021. That study found the electric utilities' current rates at the time were not sufficient to fund ongoing obligations. So we did develop a set of proposed increases to tackle the operating deficits and capital funding strategy. We did do the cost of service and rate design. So cost of service, we identified some inequities and developed a phase-in plan to move our customers towards what it cost us to serve them. And in the rate design efforts, we introduced that third tier for our residential customers, as well as introduced some discounted lighting rates. This go around, we started in 2023. Our first presentation to you all was about a year ago. We tackled the pole attachment fee update and really talked about rate setting fundamentals, what goes into a rate study, what are the different steps, how do we approach things methodology-wise. And then we came to you back in November to talk about the electric utility specifically, along with the CETA, to look at some preliminary numbers and kind of get some of your feedback at that time.
Hey, Paul, it's Commissioner
Yep.
Tupper. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit for those who are not as deep into this process about what you looked at with CETA.
Okay. So CETA is the Clean Energy Transformation Act. It is a program that was introduced a number of years ago by the Washington legislator. What it basically is trying to do is kind of nudge our utilities, push them in the direction where we can offer some assistance to some low income customers. There's a lot of different numbers that are involved with the legislation. They talk about energy burden. So it's really identifying the customers that fall within what they call an energy burden. There's a number of metrics. You got to fall below a certain income threshold to first qualify, and then you need to spend a certain percentage of your annual income on energy bills. So if you kind of fall into those two categories, the utilities need to develop a kind of an assistance program to help those customers with those bills. So the CETA analysis that we looked at was looking at the numbers, looking at some census information to get a sense of, well, how many customers do we think you all have that would fall into these this energy burden, and how many costs or how much of a lift are we looking at to get us to the different milestones that CETA has. And the different milestones, we have one at 2030. I think we need to get to 60% of the ultimate goal, and the ultimate goal we need to hit by 2050. So that's kind of super high level in terms of what CETA is and kind of how we're looking at it. Does that help?
Yeah. So one quick question for you. Thanks for that background. It's obviously you've done some background, some research, obviously with our help. You've gotten information from us, maybe from our legal counsel as well. So my question is how that is baked into what you're going to present to us already? Are you still waiting on more information? And if you do have the information you need, kind of what percentage of our increase would be attributed, and this is a fairly nebulous question, I get that, would be attributed to the impacts that CETA will have on us?
Yeah, so the potential impacts for CETA are not baked into our operating cost or numbers that we're going to review with you tonight. That was a separate analysis that we're looking at to kind of understand what the impacts may be, how you guys want to address the impacts, how aggressive you want to get in terms of how, when you want to hit the milestones. That's kind of where it's going to be up to you in terms of, what are the impacts on our customers.
Thank you.
So again, yeah, we went in November, talked about the revenue requirement in CETA. Tonight's discussion is going to be focused really on the revenue requirement portion of the electric rate study. And before we get into some of the numbers, I did want to highlight a couple key changes that we've made since our discussion in November. The first change is recognizing that you have adopted a capacity charge to help offset some of the substation costs. We are including that in the analysis. As of today, that is approximately $400,000 in additional annual revenue that we can put towards our capital plan. So that was kind of key change number one. Key change number two is we have been working and looking into the broadband and water and sewer utilities. It looks like the broadband utility will be operating at a deficit this year. So that deficit is approximately $400,000. We are assuming the electric utility will cover that full $400,000 this year.
Hey,
Yep.
Paul, Randall has a question.
You go ahead.
I think you're muted.
Thank you. I was going to let you finish that. So I guess maybe this is a question for staff. I think we know that broadband isn't scheduled to be cash positive this year. And the question is, where is the money coming from? This is making it look like it's coming from the electric utility. My understanding was we were making that up with the property tax revenue, that it is not associated with any one division. So I don't know if that's a question for staff or if the consultant wants to take that.
Yeah, sorry, go. Was that you, Kevin? I couldn't.
Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, so we are proposing, at least for tonight's discussion, that the deficit in 25 would be covered all by electric. You are right, Commissioner Randall, that we have assumed that all the property tax and timber revenue that may be budgeted in the electric utility, we've pushed that into the broadband utility. But even with that additional revenue, we're still anticipating a deficit for that utility. Starting in 2026, as we get some of these grants and we start getting, our customer base set up, we are thinking that the broadband utility would begin to be self-sufficient starting next year. So it's kind of this really kind of transitionary period where the broadband utility needs a little money this year. And we've assumed the electric utility would be on the hook for that.
Okay, and I guess this is numbers are important. So if you take out the property tax revenue and whatever else you're throwing in there, timber, et cetera, is it still a $400,000 deficit that by lumping it together with electric, then it's okay? Or is the electric subsidy less than that?
So the property tax revenue is included in that 400,000. So another way to answer that would be if we removed the property tax revenue that was budgeted for the electric utility, that $400,000 deficit would be bigger. The property tax revenue we've shifted over, I believe, is a couple $100,000 in 2025. So that deficit would be a little bit bigger if we didn't move the property tax over.
Okay,
The total property tax, I think, was 580,000. I don't remember how we split that in the budget.
It was split 80-20, so it would have been, we would be closer to probably 900,000, Jeff, if we did not include the property tax into the broadband.
And I don't want to put you on the spot, but timber revenues, I don't know the number on the timber revenues either, if they've included that into this.
The 600,000 in everything we received from the county. So that's the property taxes and the timber. So yeah, we would be closer to between 900,000 and $1 million deficit, Jeff, if we did not have taxes.
And then and sorry to kind of diverge on this a little bit, but what is the total broadband budget again for 2025 roughly?
I don't recall right off the top of my head, Jeff. I want to say it's a couple million.
Oh, no.
Was it the operating budget might be, but the
Operating
total
revenue?
budget with the grant money was considerably larger, wasn't it? Because of the capital improvement on the broadband side.
I guess my concern is what are we, what number are we balancing? So to add another 400,000 gets us to a rough budget of what?
The operating revenues was that for the broadband was a little over $2 million, and with about just under $1 million in revenue coming in.
Okay, that's enough for now. Thank you for the clarifications.
Sure thing. So these two changes were kind of the biggest items that have shifted since that November presentation. Overall, it's a slight positive since we have that capacity fee revenue coming in on an ongoing basis. We're covering that broadband deficit in 25, and then the assumption is that broadband would be self-supportive thereafter. So with that, I'd like to jump in some of the numbers. Before we talk through some of the scenarios that we've put together, I do want to go through the numbers again for the electric utility. So some of the key components we're looking at in that table on the top left, I'm showing you some of the key revenues and some of our key expenses. What are the ranges over the 25 to 28 time period? So revenues, 46 to 48 million about through 28. O&M expenses anywhere from 18 to 20 million. Power expenses from Bonneville, we're looking at 17 to 20 million as well. Existing debt service is about $6.3 million. And the total capital program we've identified over the 4-year window, just shy of 74 million. If you look at the graphic on the top right, you can kind of see how that 74 million is shaped, where we kind of have two peak years in 26 and 27. I'll show you the details in the next slide in terms of how.
Paul, before we move along, it's Commissioner Tupper again. Just for clarification, other than the total CIP, those other numbers are are per year, correct? That's our range of revenues is 46 to 47 million per year, correct? That's not an aggregate of all over the whole course, right?
That is correct.
Okay, just to be, so we're keeping those numbers clear. And Jeff, your hand was still up too, just to let you know. I don't know if you had a question or not. Okay, thank you. So again, yeah, just want to make sure we were clear on that. And I just
Sure.
one quick question on those numbers. Was that based off of numbers you got from us, or did you guys do some due diligence on your own at looking at BPA costs overall, or anything? Just curious of what you went off of those numbers.
Sure. So for the operating expenses, we're using the 2025 budget as the baseline, and then escalating each line item expense with an assumed inflationary factor. Power expense is a little different. So we've developed a load profile by month throughout the forecast for our different customer groups. We take that load and we kind of feed it into our own internal forecast of BPA power costs. We're using their adopted federal fiscal year 24 and 25 rate schedules to do that. In order to forecast Bonneville cost starting this October, we do have to make some assumptions in terms of how they're going to be adjusting their rates. What we've assumed for that cost inflation is a 9% adjustment to power and a 20% adjustment to their transmission rates this October. Those percentages are based on kind of the latest figures that they've leaked out to us. We won't necessarily know the final rates till probably the July period of this year. The other component of Bonneville rates that we are forecasting is your tier 2 power needs. So we are exceeding that tier 1 threshold that Bonneville is contractually obligated to provide us. Starting this October, we are going to be purchasing some additional power anticipated through Bonneville's tier 2 product. Right now, that product costs about $60 a megawatt hour. Based on current power prices, it's likely that product is going to fall, close to $80 a megawatt hour this October. So we are building in that cost inflation starting next year for that tier 2 component of the Bonneville bills.
Thank you. Yes, the power expense is the one that always catches my eye because it's hard to determine just exactly how it's going to go and how much conservation we have and different things like that. So that's the only number up there that kind of, I'm a little curious about more than anything. And thanks for the answers to all those questions.
Sure. So those are some of the numbers. To give you a little more detail on some of the escalation factors, and Commissioner Randall, your hand's up.
Yeah, I just wanted to, that tier 2 rate. Could you talk a little bit about how much of our total power that we're going to be buying we think we might be exposed to that? And could you also talk a little bit about what those tier 2 historic rates have been compared to 8 cents a kilowatt hour?
Yeah, so to give you an understanding, we are looking at around 2 megawatts of tier 2 purchases, from over the next 3 years, each year for the next 3 years. Our total power needs are about 45 megawatts. So we're purchasing about 2 of those on the tier 2 market. And to give you a sense on pricing, if we look back 5 years, the tier 2 product that Bonneville offered was almost identical to the tier 1 product in terms of pricing. That has changed pretty significantly over the past 3 or 4 years. So right now they are charging about $60 a megawatt hour. A year ago, they were charging about $65 a megawatt hour. Again, just based on kind of where power prices are today, we are modeling an $80 per megawatt hour, at least for next year.
I'm sorry, this is Joel, and I had a quick question on that. So you said we're averaging about 2 megawatts of tier 2 purchases. Is that pretty consistent, or has that changed over the last few years?
So looking back over the, past 10 years, I don't believe you guys have been purchasing tier 2 power. I mean, I know you did in 2023, but I believe that was kind of an odd duck year. It's really starting this October where, you're anticipated to exceed your tier 1 threshold that Bonneville offers you. And so you need to turn elsewhere to purchase power. So no, you haven't really been participating in this tier 2 market much over the last 5-10 years.
Thank you.
Sure. So before we move on to the next slide, a couple of key, inflationary factors I wanted to let you know on. In terms of rate revenue and load growth, we are anticipating our residential customers to grow by about 1% per year. But all our other customers, we're anticipating no growth in terms of load or accounts over the 25 through 28 rate setting period. As I mentioned before, O&M expenses are based on the 25 budget. Each line item is inflated between 3 and 6%, depending on what type of expense it is. The average annual inflationary uptick is about 3.3% per year. And then we covered those last 2 points on the power costs in terms of what are we assuming for Bonneville's next increase in October, and what are we assuming for tier 2 costs starting in October as well. So as I mentioned, I did want to show you a little more detail on the capital plan. So this table shows you the total annual capital costs by type of capital. I've highlighted those substation projects. Those are good candidates for debt financing since they're long-lived assets that are going to be benefiting, pretty much the entire system. Maybe before I go on, Commissioner Collins, your hand is up.
Yes, thank you. Going back to the purchase of tier 2 power, with only a 1% increase anticipated in residential growth and no growth for the other classes, do you have any idea what our expense might be? And particularly given our history of not having to purchase from tier 2, how do you calculate? How do you come up with any kind of a figure to anticipate our need to purchase tier 2 power going forward?
Sure. And Kevin and Mike may be able to provide a little more detail, but the way I understand it works is, Bonneville is setting their rates every 2 years. The next rate cycle will actually be for 3 years, but typically it's been a 2-year period. So pretty much every rate cycle before they, adopt their rates, they approach you all. They work on a load forecast with you all to determine what they think your total load is going to be. You have contractually entered into an agreement with them to provide you, a certain amount of power. If they, your staff and them, if they think your power needs are going to exceed that contractual amount, then you're obligated to buy that additional amount somewhere else. In this case,
understood. But what I'm asking is, what's the data that suggests we're going to have to purchase tier 2 power?
Okay. So right now you're already above that threshold. Bonneville is kind of giving you a grace period. They didn't necessarily anticipate you being above this maybe over the last rate cycle, but you're already there. So you're already above that. And, to them, you need to start planning to purchase that additional power for the next rate cycle.
Okay, thank you.
So Paul, maybe Kevin would weigh in a little bit here because, our new contracts we're going to sign in December, and the contract high water marks, ours is probably going to change a little. And I don't remember the formula, whether we were going to lose a little bit of our headroom or gain or stay the same. Maybe Kevin, do you know that number off the top of your head? And one other thing about the tier 2 power, it's not only that we're going to buy tier 2 power, but in the past, it may not align with where we're going to have to buy it now. And the price of that power could be $100 or it could be $1,000 a megawatt when we need it. So there's always the chance of when you need it comes into play. So.
Yeah. And to address that point, Bonneville typically locks in that tier 2 product they offer. It's not going to necessarily change over the year, depending on power fluctuations. They're going to kind of lock it in on a year-by-year basis. You're not obligated to buy that product. You can seek out your own power to address, that deficit. And depending on the product you purchase, it could fluctuate with power prices. You could lock it in at a certain rate. So it's kind of dependent on the product that you're purchasing.
Yeah, so Paul, I'll have Kevin maybe give us that number. Maybe he knows off the top of his head.
So it depends on how they finalize the contract. Right now, we will get a pinch more to our high water mark, but that is not enough to offset our tier 2 purchase. And to your question, Ken, as long as you don't exceed that, I believe it's a 1 megawatt tier 2 power, they keep you in the lower rate. So we've just been bumping right there for the last several years, Ken, and that's why it kind of looks like all of a sudden we're jumping over, but we're in a grace area based on the small amount we've gone over with the tier 2.
And the other option is again, I'm assuming that as a board at one point here, we'll have to have this discussion that we'll decide to take the tier 2 product on our contract. Otherwise, our options are a purchase power agreement somewhere with another utility or balancing authority or something, which could conceivably be a lot more than what Bonneville would supply. Is that accurate, Kevin?
Yeah, we have always elected, because you do have to elect what you're going to do for tier 2. We've always elected to have Bonneville Power supply us at the tier 2 rate.
Okay, Paul, I guess it's back to you.
Okay. So to finish up the discussion on the capital plan, I'm highlighting the substation costs. These are the good candidates for debt financing. We're also, as you're going to see in a moment, we're going to look at, can we defer them? What are the impacts of deferring some of these costs? As you'll see in a couple slides from now, we don't really have the ability to defer these substations more than a year or two without some significant risks to service. So I did want to point that out to you all. So in the next slide, I'm showing you the overall revenue requirement for the electric utility. In this graphic on top, the colored bars represent our expenses. We have the blue bar operating, orange power, yellow debt. The green bar represents our total capital plan. And that solid black line represents our total operating revenues coming in before any rate adjustments. So what I'm seeing here is that our revenues before rate adjustments are able to cover all our ongoing expenses, all our debt service repayment needs, but that doesn't leave a lot of cash flow left over every year to address the capital program. So likely when we develop a capital funding program, we're going to be looking at a combination of rate action and outside funding sources such as debt to help achieve this capital program over the next 4 years. And Commissioner Collins, I see your hands up.
Yes, thank you, Paul. Could you go back to the previous slide? So I'm assuming that the new line construction takes into consideration passing on some of that cost to the customer who is requesting additional services or new service.
So I believe we do not have the capital projects that will be funded through KAYAK or capital projects that will be donated through KAYAK reflected in this table.
Correct.
So it doesn't include the integration of the capacity charges that were mentioned earlier.
We are including the capacity charges, so it's about $400,000 a year in revenue coming in.
And that's subtracted from the cost of construction.
It is not subtracted. So I'm showing you the total substation cost. We have the $400K coming in per year to help offset some of those costs, but that is not subtracted from these totals.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And Commissioner Randall?
Yeah, I had a question that's probably for staff. The bottom row there, headquarters facilities, there's about 4.5 million over 4 years. I wonder if staff could talk about that line item a little bit.
So at our 310 Four Corners shop, we have talked about expanding our yard towards a substation where we would knock down those trees, put up a metal building and expand our yard so that, for example, the fiber yard out front can be moved back in that area. We have some other infrastructure changes in those dollars, but it's primarily for the new yard off to the side here.
Okay, and is that trying to get, I mean, and we've talked about yard improvements over the years. Is this trying to get more things undercover also?
The building would house a lot of things we have now out under the thing, but depending on finances, Jeff, the buildings, there's a swag in there to try to justify the costs.
Okay, thank you.
And Paul, as Commissioner Tupper, when you move on to that next slide, I have a question right out the gate.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
So looking at this slide, I'm curious as to how you take into account, because this is revenue requirement, obviously the money we need to operate the organization. I'm curious about reserves, how we're anticipating the increase that would be needed to meet our risk management policies of 90 days cash, and how that's going to fit in, especially once broadband takes a different aspect here as far as the amount of revenue it's going to bring in, the amount of revenue we would need to have for a 90-day at that point. How did you approach reserves when you looked at this cash operating expenses or whatever bucket that falls into for reserve, building the reserve and maintaining the reserve?
Yeah, so as you'll see when we get to the scenarios, depending on how aggressive we want to be, how soon we want to hit some of our reserve targets, that's going to move the needle in terms of the rate action. But to give you an idea, this is kind of identifying the costs, the revenue. This graphic here doesn't show our cash reserves. What I'm showing you on this next slide here is without any rate action, without any new debt or other, funding to come in to help address the capital program, we would anticipate the electric utility running out of money this year. Now you do have that $5 million line of credit. So if you want to draw down from that this year, that would help the electric utility, meet or stay above zero in terms of those cash reserves. But starting in 26, even with that line of credit, we would anticipate cash reserves falling below zero without any rate action or new debt.
So as you proceed forward, if you could add through that prism of reserves, when you talk about different impacts and how the rates would be adjusted or expenditures would have to be made, could you also do that with the lens of what the effect or impact on reserves would be?
Yes, and we can talk about that in 2 slides. You'll see some numbers relative to those reserves.
Thank you.
So yeah, let's move on to the scenario discussion. Before we look at, some of those reserve metrics on the next slide, I wanted to frame the 2 scenarios that we've developed for today's discussion. The first scenario, no capital deferments. So we've identified the capital projects. We're not going to shift anything around. We want to fully fund it as it stands today. What are the rate increases required to do that? Under this scenario, we're going to, bring in about $38 million of new debt proceeds next year. Scenario 2, we're going to defer the 26 and 27 substation and headquarter projects by a year. So that in 2026, we have about $20 million of substation and headquarters projects. We're going to shift that from 26 to 27. In 27, we have another $20 million of substation and headquarter projects. Excuse me. We're going to shift that 20 million to 28. Under scenario 2, where we do make those deferments, we're still going to be looking at a new debt proceed coming in 27, this time about 39 million. The reason it's a little bit bigger is because we've deferred some capital. That capital is then subject to another year of cost escalation. It would anticipate to cost us a little bit more. So in that bottom table, what are the percent adjustments proposed under those two scenarios, and what, how would a typical residential consumer be impacted if we did across the board type changes. So that first scenario, we would be looking at 3 years of 11.5% adjustments, followed by an inflationary level adjustment afterwards. That would take, an average residential bill to about $190 per month. Under scenario 2, where we're deferring some capital, we're proposing still doing an 11.5% increase up front, but that enables us, the deferment of capital and doing that higher increase up front enables us to bring down the annual rate action to about 5 3/4 thereafter. So a typical residential bill would go up to about $175 per month under scenario 2. Now, in terms of some, additional numbers related to these two scenarios, and this addresses some of the concerns related to our cash reserve targets. Under this table, you can see the proposed rate adjustments. You can see when we're issuing debt and how much debt we are proposing to bring in. And then the next couple lines have to do with our ending reserve balances for the utility. So under the first scenario, you can see that row, combined ending fund balances, those would be our forecasted ending fund balances for the utility in each year. Beneath that is line of credit. So if we kind of plan for the line of credit to be not necessarily used, but relied on by the utility to help meet targets, that helps bring our cash a little higher. But even under scenario 1, we are not able to meet both our operating and capital target. Only in 2026 are we able to achieve that. We're able to achieve the operating reserve target in 26 and 28, but not 25 and 27. So with these increases, we're able to fund the capital program, but we are not able to hit, both our reserve targets in every year of this period. Scenario 2, you'll see kind of a similar picture there where, in 2027, we're able to meet our combined reserve targets, but in 25, 26, and 28, we can't meet both of them. Although in 2028, we are able to meet our operating target. It's just the capital target where we're not able to achieve. So Commissioner Tupper, does that help you think about some of these reserve targets? Do you have any follow-up questions at this time?
Well, it does, but again, the line of credit concerns me, even the way we utilize it now in the risk management, way of looking at our reserves. I really like to look at this as I would rather have the full amount of cash reserve in place, which again, this is a question for the board and the policies that we have, whether we could change or we just go with what we have. But again, I'm looking at also, does it make sense for us to somewhat bake in a certain amount of rate increase to basically capital fund some portion of these projects through revenue rather than trying to borrow the money? Because again, no matter what number you look at, the amount of money that has to be borrowed, I don't know what the interest rates are going to be. I don't know what the terms are, but I'm leaning towards not deferring any of the capital improvement because it's already been put off for too long. And so again, with supply chain issues and, a lot of competition out there for the materials like the substation transformers, we need to get that stuff in the queue earlier rather than later. And I think the money needs to be there that we can be somewhat certain that we can make those orders and have the money to back it up and not hope that the revenue comes in later. So there was a lot there. Hopefully that made sense. But that's kind of where my thinking is at the moment as we look at these different scenarios and decide what direction we want to take. So reserves, again, what would it take to have all cash reserve versus figuring the line of credit in there? That's something that would be a substantial amount, that would have to be baked into the rates, in my opinion. Did that make sense?
Yeah, that made sense. And so to kind of explore that a little bit, scenario 1, we're able to almost hit both reserve targets in 28 without the help of the line of credit. I mean, we're short by about $1 million in that year. Scenario 2 is, we're really trying to kind of pull the pressure off as much as we can. We're not able to meet, our combined reserve targets by 2028. We're a little off. But I did want to kind of show you some of those options.
Yeah, so the short takeaway for me is I think our rates are going to have to reflect a little more of a revenue-based way of financing some of our capital improvement. That's kind of the quick version of where I was going.
Okay. Commissioner Randall, see your hands raised.
Yeah. Let's see. My question related to, and this might be a Mike question, what financing products we're aware of right now for that 37 to 39 million that's shown there, and would that be RUS products, approximate interest rates today, approximate length of terms and years of those products? Maybe just talk about that a little bit, whoever wants to take it.
Jeff, actually, some of that's on the next slide. We did have FCS look at RUS as the product. There are different options we can use, but for these scenarios, FCS did use RUS debt, and they actually have some information. I believe it's on the next slide or within a slide or two. So that hopefully your question will get answered, Jeff.
The interest rates aren't indicated on the next couple of slides unless I missed it.
Yeah, so if you go to the slide previous to this one, there's a note at the bottom in terms of the terms we're assuming. So for these scenarios, we've assumed a 20-year term, 4.5% interest rate with 1% issuance cost. That seems to be in line with what RUS is offering at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess one question I would have is, I know we had a presentation about CoBank. I mean, we're talking about RUS. Is there a delta between the two at the moment that we know of in the interest rate? I mean, obviously the markets are changing and, federal policies are changing, so I get it. But waiting could be worse than going now, so.
No, I haven't looked at CFC rates or CoBank's rates here within the last little bit to know what the difference is between RUS debt and CoBank and CFC. RUS is going to be cheaper than the other two just because of the backing that they have.
And with the amount of debt that we already have through RUS, which I think is about 90 million, I know that's a rough figure. What is our ceiling? How much would we anticipate they'd be willing to go? Just because I know we have numbers here for capital improvement of 73 million over whatever amount of time it was. Is that something that we would expect we could get it all from RUS?
Yeah, we could get it all from RUS.
Okay.
And I guess I had one more question on that too. It seems like when we deal with RUS, we get good products, but sometimes it's pretty slow. Do we have a realistic timeline about how long it might take to actually get that funding?
Kevin's going to take that one.
So to get the RUS funding, we have to complete our 4-year work plan. Because that's what RUS loans against, is your 4-year work plan. Our ICP, our engineer of record, should have the 4-year work plan done the end of February, 1st of March. We have been dealing with ICPE and Rodney Peach, our RUS GFR. But then Jeff, once he signs off on it, has to go to Washington, D.C. And usually that's where the bottleneck happens. We're one of hundreds. It may mean we have to stay very focused and involved with RUS to make sure it doesn't take years to get all this through, that it will take months and months regardless, but we would have to be active with the RUS people to make sure we stay on top of it.
Could you elaborate on what you mean by that?
So we're going back to Washington, D.C. It's sitting down with RUS. It's talking to Rodney Peach. There's a lot of scenarios that have to happen to keep this on their front burner. And it's not just one trip, it's multiple trips at different times to make sure all questions are answered, that our engineering firm has dotted all the I's and crossed the T's. I do think we can get it pushed through fairly quickly, but it will take effort from all of us as staff to do it.
So I guess my one last question, I'm going to put you on the spot. Is this all something you think we can do in the time we have left with you as the general manager?
No. It will take longer than the 5 months. Because to get it through Rodney, and I'm throwing fictitious dates out, but to get it through Rodney will take maybe a month. And then it gets shipped off to Washington, DC. Because we're a PUD, it has to go through legal channels. It's different.
The reason I set you up for that was because, as I stated earlier, I don't think this is something, this capital improvement plan is something we can put off for very long. There's a lot of reasons why we need to move forward and decide soon as to how we want to move forward.
So as Mike pointed out before, the next slide, there is some more information about financing. So what we've put together for you today in terms of these two scenarios, let's get the capital done as it's laid out. We're getting real close to our reserve target by 2028 without line of credit. Scenario 2, we're deferring some substation and headquarter projects by a year. A bigger upfront increase then to kind of lower the next 3 years to kind of 5 3/4. Cash reserves are lower, by 2028 there, as you can see by the slide. When we think about the other levers we can pull and see how, rates might change, it really has to do with debt in terms of these two scenarios. So on the capital plan, we can't really defer the substation projects any longer. My understanding is if we push them out more than 1 to 2 years, there's risk to service. So we haven't looked at that. Moving on to the next lever we can kind of pull has to do with that debt financing. So we're projecting, close to $40 million of debt under both scenarios. We're assuming a 20-year term right now. Well, do you all want us to look at, assuming a 25 or 30-year term, extending the life of the loan, alleviating pressure now, but, over the lifetime of the loan, you'll end up paying more in interest costs. Other lever is looking at interest-only payments. So RUS does allow you to have 2 years of interest-only payments on the debt products they offer. Is that something you all, want to explore and see how that might affect rates? I don't think either of these things are magic bullets. They're not going to take the 11% and turn them to 3s, but they could, shave 1% or so off the near-term increases if we want to extend the loan and go interest-only. So any thoughts on pulling additional levers or what?
There's 2 hands. We'll go first.
Sorry, who's first?
Ken.
Okay.
So I wonder what it would look like if the rate increases were equalized over that 4-year period of time. And if you increase the rates 7.5% per year for each year, at the end of 4 years, you have a 30% increase. Would that be practical in terms of being able to cover our increasing recurring costs, setting aside the issue of borrowing $40 million for the capital budget?
So the question is, if we ignored capital, what are the rate increases we need to fund operations and hit our reserve targets?
Yes. Can it be done? Can it be done by equalizing the yearly increases?
Yeah, so to fund operations and hit our reserve targets, I mean, I could run that scenario on the fly if you'd like. It would be probably considerably lower. The pressure the utility is facing is really on the capital program. But if you would like, Commissioner Collins, I could, spend a couple minutes to show you those numbers, or I could prepare them for you after the call.
After the call is fine, unless the other commissioners are interested in getting that information today.
I'm kind of interested in it if it's, if it can be accurately provided. Otherwise, afterwards is fine. I think accuracy is the most important thing. Did you have anything else, Ken? So the point I was going to bring up when you talk about interest only payments for 2 years, just as a reminder, that's what the PUD did with the original RUS loan, the 115 million, whatever. The first 2 years were interest only payments because the utility was getting up and running. One of the questions I have, and this is, I guess, for Kevin. So we're looking at this roughly $40 million infrastructure improvement in the electrical system. And I don't know how many years ago we could have kind of anticipated this was going to be needed eventually. Are we able to look ahead and say that we're going to be good for 20 years, or are we going to need another substation someplace in the next 20 years?
With predicted growth, we will be good with our substations the way they are. The hard part is, Jeff, we're gonna have to upgrade some feeders out of the substation so we can intertie better. And if you notice on those line feeders in that slide 3 or 4 back, that's why those numbers are 600,000 or 100,000, because we are gonna have to update some of that to help offset some voltage problems. And I'm hoping next meeting, we can actually talk about some areas where we have voltage problems, why the 2-year time frame, and how to, there is some options. We can possibly delay the yard improvements. There's things like that we can talk about. And as a board, you can give us direction to, maybe look at things a little different.
Okay, but I guess the point is those improvements aren't $40 million improvements. Those are kind of tweaks and upgrades to the existing system that are significantly less expensive.
One big project is 4 million for the yard improvements. That's a bigger job that could be moved out a ways.
Are you done, Jeff?
I am done.
So this is Commissioner Tupper. Couple thoughts. We're at 50, 60-year-old infrastructure. And, everywhere I go, conferences, PPC, wherever it may be, I'm hearing, the challenges that all the utilities are facing, with capacity and other things, and the supply chain, the amount of time it takes to get what you need. In this case, our case, it's going to be substation transformers. We know we have a new one, we have one on order. But to do the things that are in this plan and to set a good basis for us to keep moving forward with everything else that we need to do on the capital side of things, I don't think we have any luxuries here. A couple of tools were talked about. As long as we can go on financing on the table, if it's 30, 35 years, whatever they offer, we have to do it. I know it's more in interest. I hate paying interest, but if that helps soften the costs of starting this process now up front to get the plan set, determine what our costs are, and get these things get our name in the queue to get this infrastructure ordered. If we delay a year, everybody out there is doing the same thing we are. It's not going to get better. It will get worse. There's some pain coming. There's just no two ways around this with the electrification of the economy and, the energy that's available and the amount of energy that's needed, a whole lot of things going into that are going to affect us in other ways. The 7.5% scenario, I don't know how that's going to play out. Again, I think that's another case of kicking the can down the road. It's not going to get enough money for us up front that we need to get this system, to get this grid up to speed, not only the next 4 years, but I would argue the next decade. So that's my thoughts on the financing and, the thought about getting, I'm fine with seeing the how it breaks out on the 7.5%, but the supply chain issues, the cost of materials, we could take a chance and wait that interest rates get better. I don't think the cost of anything is coming down for a lot of the reasons I just stated. So again, I hate to say this. I don't like debt either, but I don't see many options for us at this point as a utility for the future and the resiliency of our grid, I think they're showing us kind of a pretty blunt look at really what we're looking at here. And it's going to be painful up front. I don't see any two ways around it. We don't do that up front. It just keeps getting more painful every time we have these discussions.
I just wanted to chime in support of one of the things that Dan said, which is I think we should look at a longer term option, that, you know, the 25, 30 years, whatever we can do, because this is, again, going to be a very significant expense, the biggest we've had since we bought the utility, and it should be something that carries us a long time. So I think we should look at a longer term financing option.
And my position is in agreement that that is what makes sense. We're making an investment in equipment that has a lifespan of 40 or 50 years, fingers crossed. And so it makes sense to finance that over time, because we can't do it out of revenue. My recommendation for 7.5% per year, it gets us to the same place, but it's focused on operating expenses. So it's independent of the need to invest in capital improvement. And I'm not at all suggesting that that should be deferred or kicked down the road, because it just takes too long to order the very expensive transformers, to build a substation. And I don't want to see us at a point of having a major failure in the next few years, because we took a risk and deferred investment in the capital plant.
Sounded like there was some in all of that.
Commissioner Collins, to answer your question, I took a quick look. If we get rid of all capital, we want to fund operations, we want to hit our reserve targets, we could get by with inflationary type adjustments over the next couple of years. The 7.75% scenario, that's going to take a little more time. That's likely going to require us to defer more capital. But that's something I can take a look at and let you know how much capital we would need to defer to hit those numbers.
See, Jeff's got his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to do a time check. Kevin, how long do you think that executive session is going to take?
We can get that in probably 40 minutes, because this is a first touch for the board on the next executive session.
Okay, and then I just wanted to say on that, you know, $4.5 million for yard improvements, I think it would be, at least I'm interested in it, like a tour of the yard, kind of explaining how we use the property now, how we might use it in the future, or if you wanted to do some sort of virtual tour with Jameson or somebody kind of doing a little video and then showing us at a commissioner meeting. I think helping us understand what we have, what we need, and what we would get would be helpful at some point too.
Will shook his head that Jameson can help us out there at a board meeting. That way we can present it to everybody.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I understand and agree that, you know, there's some things that we can push off, but when it comes to the strengthening of the grid, the resiliency of the grid, those projects, which are going to be the major projects. I mean, Kevin noted this other one that is not quite as concerning. It's still a large amount of money, and my point is we should not be deferring any of that grid related capital. We need to get going with it.
Okay. So we're almost out of time here. I got a couple more slides to go through. I just wanted to bring you back to the rate survey. When we showed you the same graphic with the same numbers in November, based on the ones we've surveyed, you're kind of middle of the road. You'll see all the way to the right, PSE, most expensive of the ones surveyed. The only new piece of information here is the UTC has approved some rate action for PSE. They've approved an 11.5% increase this year. and then a 6.4% overall increase in 2026. So we know, these other jurisdictions, including PSE, are looking at potentially large increases. We've seen how it's kind of shaking out with PSE. It would be interesting to see how it shakes out with some of these other neighboring jurisdictions. And then finally, this is the last slide. Really what we're trying to get is your direction on the overall revenue requirement. What scenarios do we want to move forward with through the cost of service and rate design analyses? From our discussion, it sounds like we do want to look at maybe a longer term bond and see how much we can decrease our rates, assuming a longer term bond. Commissioner Collins, you've requested a scenario 7.5%, 7.75% increases per year. How do we make that work? How much capital will we need to defer?
Let me clarify. That's assuming that we borrow $40 million for the capital projects. It's not in any way suggesting that we try to fund those projects out of our revenue stream.
Right. And so the two scenarios we looked at today, we're looking at either the 11.5% upfront or a larger upfront followed by kind of smooth increases. I will take a look at that 7.5 and see how it shakes out.
Thank you.
Commissioner Randall?
If you could bounce back to the prior slide, Paul.
Sure.
I was just reading the fine print. So I appreciate you guys did an apples to apples comparison of a customer who uses 1,000 kilowatt hours a month, so 12,000 kilowatt hours a year. I used to check lots of people's power bills. That's kind of a low, power usage. You get some people who use a little bit less than that, but you get people who use 3 times as much as that. So just for commissioners to keep in mind, that's you did pick an apples to apples, which is very useful. So, but that's what it's based on. It's kind of a low power consumption number.
Yep. And to give you some context around that number, we've looked at some of your customer data. An average residential monthly bill is around 1,000, but as you noted, during the winter time, if you're heating with electric, that's going to be larger. Or if you have a larger home, maybe a larger family, you're going to have a higher number. So like you said, there's different users in the system. So in terms of next steps, I want to make sure I'm capturing the direction appropriately. I know we want to look at a longer term bond and seeing how that, shakes out. And then Commissioner Collins, that 7.5, or was it 7.5 or 7.75?
Let's say 7.75.
Okay. Doing the 7.25 smooth.
I'll see you a quarter and raise your quarter.
We'll take a look at that, see how the numbers shake out for your consideration.
So was there any other direction you're looking for, Sergey and Paul?
I don't think so at this moment. So it's really kind of for the electric utility, how do we want to move forward with the overall increases? We have kind of 2 pieces of direction. We will work on those numbers and get you something soon. And we'll kind of work forward into the cost of service analyses, make sure that's set up so that, we're ready to share some numbers soon with you all.
So one other quick question, and that's on the water side of the ledger on the cost of service and rates there. What's the schedule for hearing about those types of things? Or is that being worked on now, or is that on a different? Okay. All right. More to come then.
Yeah, as Kevin noted, we are working on that and there's more to come.
All right. Are there any other questions? Sounds like you got the direction. Are there any other questions at this point from anybody? About the process, about the options we're pursuing? Seeing none, I'll say thanks, Paul and Sergey, again for a fine presentation. Hopefully we didn't throw you too many curveballs. As Kevin said, this was kind of the first touch on this one too. So looking forward to hearing from you guys again.
Yeah, and I really
Thank
I really appreciate your guys' time tonight, and we'll be talking soon.
All right.
Thank you.
So with that, we will move along to item 5, which is an executive session. So do we need, how much time are we going to need for that? 40 minutes?
Yes, if we could just have a short break before the next meeting, let's say we will come back into session at 3:50.
So you want to break before we go?
No,
What do
we
you
will
suggest?
go to executive session now, and then we'll come back at 3:50 is when the executive session would end.
Okay.
Gives us about 45 minutes.
Okay, so I'll read. The board is going to go into executive session per RCW 42.30.110, paragraph A, subparagraph I, to consider matters affecting national security. We will come back into regular session at 3:47.
I'd go 3:50.
3:50. We'll call it 3:50. With that, we will retire to executive session unless Joel has any additions to what I said.
All good, Commissioner.
All right, until 3:50.
No, I think.
This is Commissioner Tupper. We've come out of our executive session. There's no action to be taken. Just make sure it looks like we still have a quorum. Jeff and Ken, you want to weigh in just to make sure we have a quorum, and I'll get us out of this and take a break real quick.
I'm here.
See Ken's name is up there. So it looks like we've come out of executive session. There's no action to be taken. We still have a quorum at this point. I am going, unless there's any other discussion on any other issues. That concludes our special meeting. I'm going to, at this point, get us out of, what's the term I'm looking for? Adjourn. There we go. Adjourn. It's on my agenda. I'm going to adjourn the special meeting at 3:51. And we will take a 9-minute break and be back at 4 o'clock for our regular meeting. So we're adjourned.